are words that lodge themselves in the human throat with such persistence that they become almost physical, phrases carried for years, rehearsed endlessly in private, revised and refined until they achieve a kind of perfection that paradoxically makes them impossible to deliver. Marcus Hale had been carrying such words for 7 years, 2 months, and 16 days, though he'd stopped consciously counting the duration somewhere around year 5. The apology had become so thoroughly integrated into his internal landscape that he barely noticed its weight anymore, the way someone living at altitude stops noticing the thinness of air. The words themselves had evolved over time, going through countless iterations as Marcus refined them in moments of solitude. In the shower, where water noise provided cover for speaking aloud, he'd practice different openings. "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago," or "I've been thinking about that day at Dad's funeral," or simply, "I was wrong." In traffic, trapped in his car with nowhere to go and nothing to do except think, he'd work through the middle sections, trying to articulate exactly what he'd been wrong about and why it had taken him so long to acknowledge it. At night, lying awake when insomnia rendered sleep impossible and his mind had nothing to occupy it except the catalogue of his regrets, he'd refine the conclusion, searching for words that would convey the depth of his remorse without sounding performative or self-indulgent. The core remained constant despite all revision: "I was wrong. I should have listened. I'm sorry I walked away." Everything else was elaboration, explanation, context that Marcus believed was necessary to make the apology complete and meaningful, but that also served the less noble function of delaying its actual delivery. The apology was meant for Aaron Hale, Marcus's younger brother by 4 years. They'd been close once, in the way that brothers often are when childhood proximity forces intimacy, sharing a bedroom until Marcus left for university, navigating their parents' divorce together during their teenage years, developing the kind of shorthand communication that comes from extended exposure to each other's patterns and personalities. Aaron had looked up to Marcus with the uncomplicated admiration that younger siblings often feel for older ones, and Marcus had taken that admiration for granted in the way older siblings often do, assuming it would persist regardless of how he treated it. Then their father had died. Sudden heart attack at 63, alive one moment and gone the next, the kind of death that leaves no time for preparation or goodbyes or the resolution of long-standing tensions. The funeral had been held on a gray Saturday in October, 7 years ago, at a church their father had attended occasionally but never with particular fervor. The service had been respectful and generic, conducted by a pastor who'd known their father primarily through committee work rather than spiritual intimacy, eulogizing a man in broad strokes that applied to many people but captured no one specifically. After the service, during the reception at their father's house, the house where Marcus and Aaron had grown up, now feeling simultaneously familiar and alien with their father's absence permeating every room, the brothers had found themselves in the kitchen, ostensibly organizing food that neighbors had brought but actually just occupying the same space and letting conversation emerge. The argument had started with logistics. Their father's affairs needed settling: estate, possessions, the house itself. Aaron had assumed they'd handle it together, would coordinate schedules and share responsibilities and make decisions jointly. Marcus had other ideas. He had a demanding job in another city, a career he'd been building for a decade, obligations that couldn't simply be abandoned because death had inconveniently disrupted his schedule. He'd suggested Aaron take the lead on estate settlement since Aaron lived locally and had more flexible employment, freelance graphic design that could be done from anywhere, which Marcus's tone had suggested was less important than his own corporate position. Aaron had pushed back. Why should he bear the burden alone just because his work was more flexible? Why did Marcus assume his time was less valuable, his obligations less pressing? Their father had been both of their fathers, the responsibility should be shared equally regardless of whose career seemed more impressive on paper. Marcus had said things. Aaron had said things in response. Neither had yelled, their family wasn't the yelling type, but the words had been sharp, cutting with the precision that only comes from intimate knowledge of where someone is vulnerable. Marcus had implied Aaron had never grown up, had never taken on adult responsibilities the way Marcus had. Aaron had implied Marcus had become exactly the kind of person their father had criticized, someone who measured worth in salary and status, who'd forgotten what actually mattered in favor of what looked good on a resume. The conversation had ended with Marcus walking out. Not storming out dramatically, just gathering his coat and saying he had a flight to catch, which was true but was also excuse to leave before the argument could continue. He'd driven to the airport believing this was just temporary friction, that they'd cool off and reconnect and eventually laugh about fighting at their father's funeral, the kind of story that becomes family mythology precisely because it's so inappropriate. That hadn't happened. Days became weeks, became months, became years. Neither brother reached out. Pride, maybe, or shame, or just the inertia that makes not acting easier than acting. They didn't formally declare estrangement, didn't announce to family or mutual friends that they were no longer speaking. They simply stopped. Stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped acknowledging each other's existence beyond the bare minimum required when other family members mentioned one of them to the other. Marcus told himself repeatedly that he'd reach out soon. Next week, next month, once work calmed down, once the right moment arrived. But next week became next month, became next year, and the right moment never materialized because Marcus was increasingly aware that any moment he chose would be wrong by virtue of how much time had already passed. How did you bridge 7 years of silence? How did you apologize for waiting so long to apologize? Life moved forward despite the silence. Marcus advanced in his career, ascending to senior management at the consulting firm where he'd worked for 12 years. He bought a condominium in a city he'd never planned to live in long-term but where he'd somehow accumulated 15 years of residence. He dated occasionally but never seriously, relationships faltering for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, but that probably had something to do with his increasing difficulty with emotional vulnerability. He aged in the way people do in their 30s and 40s, not dramatically, but noticeably, his hairline receding slightly, his face accumulating lines that would become permanent, his body requiring more maintenance to achieve the same functionality. Every birthday reminded him of the growing gap. Marcus was 42 now, Aaron was 38. They'd lost their late 30s together, years that should have included the kind of adult-sibling relationship they'd never quite achieved. Marcus imagined what that relationship might have looked like: regular phone calls, visits during holidays, mutual interest in each other's lives beyond obligatory updates through their mother. He imagined being the kind of brothers who actually knew each other as adults rather than just carrying childhood memories that grew less relevant with each passing year. But imagining required doing nothing. Actual reconciliation required action, required risk, required exposing himself to possible rejection or, worse, discovering that Aaron had moved on completely and no longer cared whether they reconciled or not. So Marcus rehearsed his apology endlessly but never delivered it. Over 7 years, Marcus made numerous attempts that didn't quite materialize into actual contact. These efforts existed in the space between intention and action, close enough to count as trying but not close enough to risk actual vulnerability. There were the text messages. Marcus had composed hundreds of them, thumb hovering over the send button, text carefully crafted to strike the right balance between serious and casual, acknowledging harm without being melodramatic, expressing desire to reconnect without demanding immediate forgiveness. Each draft would sit there, cursor blinking, Marcus staring at it and finding reasons it wasn't quite right. Too formal. Too casual. Too long. Too short. Assumed too much or too little. Made excuses when it should just apologize, or apologized without sufficient context for why it had taken so long. He'd saved some of these drafts, had a folder on his phone labeled simply A, that contained 47 unsent messages, a chronicle of 7 years of refined but undelivered contrition. Occasionally he'd scroll through them, noting how his approach had evolved. Early attempts were defensive, explaining his perspective on the original argument before apologizing for his reaction. Middle period messages acknowledged wrongdoing more directly but still hedged, still protected his ego through various linguistic softeners. Recent drafts were more direct, more willing to admit fault without qualification, but also perhaps more desperate in tone, aware that time was working against him. None had been sent. Each time, something had stopped him: fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear that words alone couldn't bridge this particular gap. Or just the creeping suspicion that texting was itself the wrong medium for this conversation, that trying to apologize for 7 years of silence through a text message was somehow cowardly, evidence that he still wasn't willing to take real risk. The emails were similar. Marcus's drafts folder contained 32 attempts at reconciliation through digital letter, some running to hundreds of words as he tried to comprehensively address everything that had happened and apologize for all of it at once. These were often written late at night after drinking, just enough to lower his inhibitions but not enough to impair his judgment, a narrow window where the urge to communicate overcame his usual caution, but he remained capable of coherent expression. Reading these emails later, sober, Marcus would always find reasons they didn't work. They tried too hard. They didn't try hard enough. They wallowed in explanation when they should just apologize. They apologized without sufficient explanation of what exactly he was apologizing for. They were too focused on his own feelings rather than on Aaron's experience. They presumed forgiveness rather than requesting it. They requested forgiveness in ways that felt manipulative, designed to make Aaron feel obligated to respond positively. None had been sent. Each sat in his drafts folder as evidence of intention without execution, effort without actual risk. Then there were the phone calls that never quite happened. Marcus had Aaron's number saved in his contacts, had never deleted it despite years of non-contact, as if keeping the number constituted some form of connection. Multiple times he'd pulled up the contact, thumb positioned over the call button, rehearsing what he'd say when Aaron answered. "Hey, it's Marcus. I know it's been a long time. I just wanted to talk." Too casual, as if 7 years of silence could be bridged by treating it as minor inconvenience rather than deliberate estrangement. "Aaron, it's me. I owe you an apology." Too abrupt. No preamble, no acknowledgement that calling out of nowhere after years of silence was itself potentially jarring or unwelcome. "It's Marcus. Don't hang up. Please. I need to tell you something." Too dramatic. Presumed Aaron would immediately want to hang up, which was maybe accurate but also created adversarial framing from the first words. He'd gotten as far as pressing the call button exactly once, on a Sunday afternoon 3 years into the estrangement. The phone had rung once before Marcus panicked and hung up, then spent the next 2 hours in a state of heightened anxiety wondering if Aaron would call back, if he'd see the missed call and know it was Marcus, if this aborted attempt would somehow make things worse rather than better. Aaron hadn't called back. The missed call had apparently been ignored or dismissed as wrong number or simply not important enough to return. Marcus told himself this was evidence that Aaron had moved on, but he knew it was more likely evidence that a single ring followed by immediate disconnection didn't register as significant enough to warrant response. The most elaborate almost attempt had been the letter. Actual physical letter, handwritten on good stationery Marcus had purchased specifically for this purpose, composed over several evenings until he'd filled 4 pages with careful script. The letter acknowledged his wrongdoing comprehensively, apologized without qualification, expressed his desire to rebuild their relationship while acknowledging Aaron might not want that, and provided his contact information in case Aaron ever wanted to reach out. Marcus had addressed the envelope, affixed postage, carried it in his bag for 3 weeks waiting for the moment when he'd actually drop it in a mailbox. That moment never arrived. The letter felt simultaneously too much and too little, too much emotional exposure made permanent through written record, too little compared to what a face-to-face conversation could achieve. Eventually the envelope had gotten crumpled in his bag, and he'd thrown it away, telling himself he'd write another version. He never did. All of these attempts shared a common feature: they preserved Marcus's control. Text, email, letter, even a phone call, all gave him ability to carefully craft his message, to revise until it was perfect, to choose exactly when and how to communicate. All protected him from the vulnerability of real-time interaction, from having to respond to Aaron's immediate reactions, from risking actual rejection or anger or indifference delivered directly rather than inferred from silence. Marcus told himself he was being thoughtful, strategic, careful not to make things worse through impulsive communication. But some part of him knew he was just being cowardly, choosing the comfort of perpetual preparation over the discomfort of actual action. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, 7 years, 2 months, and 16 days after the argument at their father's funeral. Marcus had just returned home from work, was preparing dinner, grilled chicken and vegetables, the kind of efficient, healthy meal that required minimal thought, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Local area code for the city where Aaron lived, but not Aaron's number, which Marcus still had saved despite years of non-use. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were usually spam, sales calls or robocalls or scams. But something made him pick up, maybe just the coincidence of the area code, maybe some unconscious recognition that this particular unknown number meant something. "Is this Marcus Hale?" A woman's voice, professional but strained. "Yes. This is Dr. Patel from Regional Medical Center. I'm calling about your brother, Aaron Hale. You're listed as his emergency contact." The world contracted to the space between Marcus and the phone pressed against his ear. Emergency contact. Which meant something had happened, something serious enough to require calling, serious enough that medical professionals needed family notified. What happened? His voice sounded distant to his own ears, as if someone else was asking the question. "He was brought in this morning with acute respiratory distress. We've stabilized him, but his condition is serious. Are you able to come to the hospital?" Details emerged through Marcus's questioning: pneumonia complicated by underlying condition Aaron apparently hadn't mentioned to anyone, requiring ICU admission, prognosis unclear but concerning. Dr. Patel was carefully professional, providing enough information to convey seriousness without either inflating or minimizing the situation. Aaron was conscious, was asking for family, had specifically asked if Marcus had been contacted. Marcus looked at his half-prepared dinner, at his apartment arranged for an ordinary evening, at the life he'd constructed around the absence of his brother, and made the only possible choice. "I'm 4 hours away. I'll leave now." He threw essentials into a bag without real thought, change of clothes, phone charger, wallet, and was in his car within 15 minutes, pulling onto the highway as the sun was setting, his mind splitting between focus on driving and rehearsal of the apology he'd been preparing for 7 years. This was it. The moment he'd been simultaneously hoping for and dreading, the forced confrontation that removed the option of continued avoidance. Aaron was in the hospital, was asking for him, which meant either Aaron wanted reconciliation or wanted to deliver his own anger face-to-face or just wanted family present during medical crisis regardless of past tensions. Marcus didn't know which, couldn't predict, could only drive and prepare as best he could for whatever awaited. The 4-hour drive felt both endless and too short. Marcus rehearsed his apology aloud, voice competing with the road noise, revising on the fly, trying to anticipate how Aaron might respond and prepare for various contingencies. But the rehearsal felt inadequate, mechanical, divorced from the actual complexity of the situation he was driving toward. Around midnight, Marcus pulled into Regional Medical Center's parking garage. The hospital was one of those sprawling modern complexes that had grown organically over decades, architectural styles from different eras combined into incoherent whole. The ICU was on the 4th floor, accessible through elevators that moved with the kind of institutional slowness that made every second feel longer. The ICU waiting room was nearly empty at this hour, just one other person, an elderly man dozing in a chair too uncomfortable for actual sleep. The nurse at the desk checked Marcus's ID, confirmed his relationship to Aaron, gave him the room number and directions delivered with practiced efficiency that managed to be both compassionate and detached. Room 417. Marcus stood outside the door, hand raised to knock, frozen by 7 years of accumulated fear and regret and uncertainty. Through the door's small window he could see Aaron in the bed, connected to various monitors and 4 lines, looking diminished in the way that hospitals make everyone look diminished. Marcus knocked. Aaron's eyes opened, tracking toward the door. Marcus entered. The room was dim, lights turned low for nighttime, machines providing ambient illumination through their displays and indicators. Aaron looked thinner than Marcus remembered, illness and time both contributing to the impression of fragility. His face was older, showing the same age progression Marcus had seen in his own mirror, the accumulation of years made visible. But his eyes were alert, tracking Marcus's approach with an expression Marcus couldn't immediately interpret. Not anger, not exactly. Not quite relief either. Something more complex, more ambiguous. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, his heart racing with the adrenaline of finally, after 7 years of preparation, having to actually deliver what he'd been rehearsing. I've been practicing this for years, he said, his voice shaking despite attempts to control it. What to say to you? How to apologize? I was wrong, about everything that day at Dad's funeral. About walking away. About not calling. I should have reached out months ago, years ago. I've been a coward, and I'm sorry, and I know, Aaron interrupted, his voice hoarse from whatever respiratory issues had brought him here but clear enough in meaning. The words stopped Marcus mid-sentence, derailed the carefully prepared script he'd been following. You, what? Aaron smiled faintly, expression that managed to be both sad and somehow amused. I know you're sorry. I've known for a while. Mom mentioned you asking about me, said you seemed like you wanted to reach out but didn't know how. And I've been. He paused, gathering breath. I've been waiting. For you to say it. But I never needed the perfect apology, Marcus. I just needed you. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any rehearsed speech could have. Not a perfect apology, not carefully crafted words, not explanation or justification or comprehensive addressing of everything that had gone wrong. Just presence. Just showing up. Just his brother, flawed and late and imperfect, but there. I waited too, Aaron continued, his voice quieter now, requiring Marcus to lean closer to hear. Thought you should call first since you walked out. Then thought it was too late, too awkward, too much time had passed. Same excuses you probably had. Both of us just stuck. They sat in silence for a moment, machines beeping their steady rhythms, the hospital continuing its night operations beyond the room's walls. 7 years of rehearsed speeches, of refined apologies, of perfectly crafted phrases, and what broke the silence was just stumbling truth, imperfectly delivered, acknowledged and accepted without ceremony. Tell me about your life, Marcus said. The last 7 years. I want to know. And Aaron did. They talked about small things first, safe territory, Aaron's work, the evolution of his graphic design business, clients he'd worked with, projects he was proud of. They talked about superficial things, movies they'd seen, books they'd read, changes in their hometown that they'd both missed by leaving. They didn't immediately dive into the deep end of reconciliation, didn't try to comprehensively address 7 years of estrangement in one conversation. That would have been too much, too heavy, too risky when Aaron's energy was limited by illness and machines were monitoring his vitals with clinical precision. But they were talking. After 7 years of silence, they were occupying the same space and exchanging words, rebuilding connection through the same process that had created it originally, just being together, sharing time, allowing familiarity to gradually overcome estrangement. Around 2 a.m., a nurse came to check Aaron's vitals, gently suggested that visiting hours were technically over and maybe the patient needed rest. Marcus stood to leave, uncertain of protocol, uncertain whether this single conversation had actually fixed anything or just opened a door. Come back tomorrow? Aaron asked, the question containing both request and uncertainty, both wanting connection and not wanting to presume. Of course, Marcus said. I'm not leaving town until. I'm just not leaving yet. Aaron's expression showed something like relief. They hadn't fixed everything, hadn't even really addressed most of what had broken them. But they'd started. They'd shown up to the possibility of repair rather than just rehearsing it privately. Marcus left the hospital and found a nearby hotel, fell into bed exhausted but unable to sleep, his mind processing what had just happened. The apology had been delivered, but not as he'd imagined. All that rehearsal, all that preparation, all those refined and revised versions, and what had actually worked was just showing up, stammering through imperfect words, being present rather than perfect. Marcus stayed in town for 2 weeks while Aaron recovered. The pneumonia resolved with treatment, the underlying respiratory issues were managed with new medication protocols, and Aaron was eventually discharged from the hospital to continue recovery at home. Marcus helped where he could, grocery shopping, handling administrative tasks that Aaron lacked energy for, just being present during the uncomfortable liminal period of illness recovery when people need company but don't have energy for substantial interaction. They didn't have a single grand conversation that fixed everything. Instead, they had dozens of small conversations that gradually accumulated into something like restored relationship. They talked about their father, about the argument at his funeral, about what each of them had actually been trying to say beneath the hurtful words. They talked about their mother, about how she'd been caught between her son's estrangement, wanting to fix it but respecting their autonomy enough not to force reconciliation. They talked about regret, not just Marcus's regret about walking away, but Aaron's regret about not reaching out, about pride that had seemed important at the time but that felt increasingly foolish as years passed. They talked about the different versions of apologies they'd each rehearsed, the countless almost attempts to reconnect that never quite materialized into actual action. "I dialed your number once," Aaron admitted during one of these conversations. They were sitting in Aaron's living room, afternoon light coming through windows, the comfortable silence of people who'd regained ease with each other's presence. "About 3 years ago. Let it ring 5 times then hung up before you could answer." "I called once too," Marcus said. "Hung up after 1 ring." They both laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, but because the parallel absurdity of it was the kind of thing brothers could share, the kind of story that would probably be retold at future family gatherings with the edge of pain softened by time. What they didn't talk about, at least not extensively, was detailed post-mortem of their 7-year silence. They didn't exhaustively catalog every hurt, didn't comprehensively address every moment where one of them could have reached out but didn't. That level of analysis would have been self-indulgent, would have prioritized perfect understanding over functional reconnection. Instead, they focused forward. Made plans to visit each other regularly, to have actual presence in each other's lives rather than just theoretical connection. Agreed to call weekly, nothing elaborate, just staying in touch the way brothers should. Planned to visit their mother together for her upcoming birthday, presenting unified front rather than forcing her to navigate their separate relationships with her. It wasn't perfect reconciliation. They didn't become instantly as close as they'd been in childhood, didn't erase 7 years of distance through 2 weeks of renewed contact. But they'd rebuilt foundation, had established that reconnection was possible and worthwhile, had chosen each other rather than just being connected by biology and shared history. When Marcus finally left to return home, Aaron walked him to his car despite still being weak from recent illness. They stood in the parking lot, awkward about goodbye, neither quite knowing how to end this visit that had restored what had been lost. "Thank you for coming," Aaron said. "When you got the call, you could have. I don't know. Made excuses. But you came." "I should have come 7 years ago," Marcus said. "Yeah. But you came now. That's what matters." They hugged, brief, masculine, the kind of hug that conveys emotion without lingering in it. Then Marcus got in his car and drove home, for hours with radio playing and his mind processing what had happened, what had been restored, what had been learned. The apology he'd been rehearsing for 7 years had finally been delivered. Not perfectly, not with all the careful phrasing he'd developed, not with comprehensive addressing of every aspect of their estrangement. Just stammered truth, acknowledged and accepted, sufficient to begin repair even if insufficient to complete it. Months later, back in his own city, his own life, his own routines, Marcus thought about the 7 years he'd spent preparing to apologize rather than actually apologizing. About all the rehearsals and revisions, the texts never sent and emails never delivered, the phone calls aborted and letters discarded. About the gap between perfect words and any words, between intention and action, between wanting to fix something and actually attempting to fix it. He'd learned something, though the lesson was almost embarrassingly simple, that perfect apologies don't exist, that waiting for ideal circumstances means waiting forever, that action, however imperfect, beats intention every time. That he'd also learned that his brother had been waiting too, had been carrying his own versions of undelivered apologies, had been just as paralyzed by fear of rejection or inadequacy or just the weight of time accumulated. That both of them had been trapped by the same barriers, waiting for the other to move first, both taking the other's silence as evidence of indifference rather than recognizing it as fear. They talked weekly now, calls that were sometimes substantial and sometimes just check-ins, maintaining connection through consistent contact rather than waiting for important things to say. They'd visited twice, Aaron coming to Marcus's city once, Marcus returning to Aaron's once, rebuilding relationship through accumulated time together rather than expecting single conversations to fix everything. Their mother had cried when they showed up together for her birthday, both sons present simultaneously for the first time in 7 years. She hadn't said, "I'm glad you fixed things," or made a big deal of their reconciliation, had just welcomed them both and let the restored relationship speak for itself. Marcus still occasionally thought about all the variations of apology he'd developed over 7 years, all the careful phrasings and thoughtful revisions. They seemed unnecessary now, excessive, the work of someone who'd been more invested in perfect words than in actual reconciliation. What had actually worked was just showing up, admitting wrongdoing simply, accepting that the other person was also human and also flawed and also carrying regrets. Some words don't heal instantly. Marcus understood that now. The apology had been delivered and accepted, but the relationship was still being rebuilt, still required ongoing work and attention and willingness to be present. Single conversations don't undo years of distance, they just open the possibility that distance can be overcome if both people are willing to put in the effort. But silence heals nothing at all. That was the other lesson, the more important one. The 7 years of silence hadn't made anything better, hadn't allowed time to fix what had been broken, hadn't resulted in natural healing through benign neglect. It had just been wasted time, years they could have been in each other's lives but weren't because both of them had chosen the safety of inaction over the risk of reaching out. Marcus couldn't recover those 7 years. Couldn't undo the silence or reclaim the time. But he could choose differently going forward, could maintain connection now that it was restored, could remember how close he'd come to losing his brother entirely because neither of them had been brave enough to risk imperfect communication. The apology that had lived in his head for 7 years was finally spoken. Not perfectly, not as he'd imagined, not with all the careful language he'd developed. Just honest acknowledgement of wrong, delivered in the moment when it finally mattered more than its own perfection. That had been enough. Not because the words were perfect, but because they were finally said. Don't wait for the perfect moment to say what matters. Say it while you still can. This is what Marcus learned through 7 years of rehearsal followed by one stumbling conversation that actually accomplished what thousands of refined drafts couldn't, genuine reconnection through imperfect but honest communication. We all do versions of what Marcus did. We carry apologies we need to deliver, gratitudes we need to express, truths we need to voice. And we wait for the perfect moment, perfect words, perfect circumstances that will make the difficult conversation easier. We rehearse endlessly, revise compulsively, prepare comprehensively, and in doing so, we avoid actually communicating. The preparation feels productive. Feels like we're working toward reconciliation, moving toward difficult conversations, taking the matter seriously enough to craft our words carefully. But preparation without execution is just avoidance dressed as diligence. And while we're preparing, time passes. Relationships drift further apart. The gap becomes harder to bridge. What was originally just conflict becomes estrangement, becomes permanent distance. Marcus's 7 years of silence didn't make his apology better. It just made it 7 years late. All that careful revision, all those perfectly crafted phrases, none of it mattered more than the simple act of showing up and saying imperfectly what needed to be said. The call to action isn't to communicate thoughtlessly, to blurt every feeling without consideration. Some preparation serves genuine purpose. Some waiting allows emotions to settle enough for productive exchange. But examine honestly, are you preparing for effective communication or just avoiding uncomfortable vulnerability? If you're carrying an apology, deliver it. Not someday when you've found perfect words, but today in whatever imperfect words you currently have. The person who needs to hear it doesn't need literary eloquence or comprehensive addressing of every nuance. They need acknowledgement of harm and genuine expression of regret, delivered while they're still able to receive it. If you're estranged from someone you love, reach out. Don't wait for them to move first, don't wait for perfect timing, don't wait until you've figured out exactly what to say. The reconciliation Marcus and Aaron achieved began with stumbling, inadequate words delivered in a hospital room at midnight. It didn't require perfection. It required presence. Because here's the truth Marcus learned too late, the perfect moment doesn't exist. Perfect words don't exist. Perfect circumstances that make difficult conversations easy, they don't exist. What exists is now, and the choice to communicate now despite imperfection, or to wait for perfection that will never arrive while relationship dies through neglect. Aaron was lucky. His medical crisis created forced confrontation that broke through years of mutual avoidance. But not everyone gets that crisis, that dramatic external force that makes reconnection unavoidable. Most estrangements just continue until one person dies and the other lives with permanent regret about conversations never had. Don't wait for crisis to force your hand. Don't wait for the universe to create circumstances that make reaching out inevitable. Choose reaching out now, while the other person is still alive, while reconciliation is still possible, while your relationship can still be repaired. It won't be perfect. The conversation will probably be awkward. You'll stumble over words, fail to express exactly what you mean, leave things partially unresolved. That's okay. That's human. Perfection isn't the goal, connection is. And connection happens through imperfect communication attempted rather than perfect communication endlessly deferred. Marcus spent 7 years preparing an apology that took 5 minutes to deliver and that was accepted despite its imperfection. 7 years of silence versus 5 minutes of stumbling truth. The mathematics are clear, imperfect action beats perfect inaction every single time. So stop preparing. Stop revising. Stop waiting for better words or better timing or better circumstances. Say what needs saying now, however imperfectly, to whoever needs to hear it, while you both still can. Be StoryWise.